Welcome to our supply and demand lecture. I'm just going to go into greater detail a little bit of what we talked about in class last week to help you understand probably one of the most iconic when people ask about economics, when you think about taking an economics class, oftentimes people talk about supply and demand, so it's good for us to understand about this. So first we'll talk about demand and then we'll talk about supply. So what is demand? It's the desire to have a good or service and the ability to pay for it. So this isn't just, oh, I wish I could have this thing or I want this thing. It's you want this thing and you have the ability to actually provide payment for that. So that's really important to think about. I don't like what I'm saying already, and I'm going to stop. And it has been probably like a minute, so now I remember blah, blah, blah. And go again. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, y'all, welcome to our most iconic of economics lecture, supply and demand. Oftentimes when people think about the fundamentals of economics, if they're not talking about scarcity, they're talking about supply and demand, because this is basically the basis of everything when it comes to economics. So first we'll talk about demand, and then we'll talk about supply, and then we'll see how they interact. Ooh, exciting, something to look forward to. All right, so what is demand? It is the desire to have a good or service and the ability to pay for it. So it's not just that you want a good or service, it's that you can also provide payment for that good and service. So when we're talking about demand in an economy, it's people's willingness to be able to pay for something and their ability to do so. So if you have an economy where people are really struggling financially, then even though there's a lot of want for goods and services, the ability to pay for them is very minimal, and therefore demand will be very low. When you have a high functioning economy, when there's a lot of people that have a lot of money in their pockets, etc., then you'll see increase in demand. So if you think about like our developed versus our developing countries, we see greater demand in our developed countries because typically we have a higher per capita income. Demand is going to be affected by price, which makes sense because this is on the consumer's perspective. So the higher the price, the less there is a willingness, the less there is an ability to pay for a product or a good or service. So we say that this is an inverse relationship. The higher the price, the lower the demand. The lower the price, the higher the demand, which makes sense, right? If you want a new pair of shoes and they're super cheap, you're going to be more willing and able to pay for those shoes. But if those shoes are super expensive, then fewer of us are going to be able to pay for those nice kicks, as the kids say. So another way we think about this is the law of demand. As prices go down, demand increases. So it's an illustration of that inverse relationship. And as prices go up, demand therefore decreases. How do we illustrate demand? There's two different ways. There's the demand schedule, which is a table that basically just shows how much at each price point, how many individuals are willing to buy for that price. So you're doing your supply and demand project right now. After you talk to those 50 individuals, when you gather your data and put it all together, you're going to first draw it out in a demand schedule. You'll start with whatever the lowest price is or the highest price, and you'll tabulate how many people will be willing to buy that price, and then the next price down, and the amount of people, and so on and so forth. What will end up happening is that more people will be willing to buy the product or the good or service at a lower price, and there will be fewer people, probably only 1 or 2 people, willing to pay at the highest level of whatever your survey results illustrate for you. When we plot that out on the very iconic supply and demand curves, etc., we see that as a demand curve, and we basically plot that out. So what that will look like, and what I'll give you some time to copy in your notes. So if we have a good or service right here, and we have 50 people in our market at $1, everyone is willing to buy this good or service. Very exciting. At $20, only 40 people are willing to buy it. At $40, 30, and so on and so forth. So when we're plotting it out, we would start with the highest price, so $50, there's one person. So on my x-axis, I have my 50, and then on my y-axis for my price, I see only one. My next price is $20, so going across there, and at $20, there's 40 people willing to pay for it. So I'm going to put a little plot point under the 40 line on my x-axis. This is so exciting to talk so mathematical. At $40, 30 people are willing to buy it, so I'm plotting it there. At $60, 20 people are willing to pay for it. At $80, 10 people, and at $100, 5 people. So I plotted out those points, and then what have I done? I've drawn a line which looks really cute right here. I really wish that I had moved this up a little bit, but you get the sense. So this is our demand schedule. This is drawing the demand curve. Demand curve will always slope down and to the right. If you see a curve going this way, going up and down like this, that's not a demand curve, because this is the law of demand, unless something is really going on in that society, and then we have some other issues to figure out. So what affects demand on this curve? So the big effect on demand is the income effect, which means the more money people have, the more they are going to be willing and able to purchase for a good or service. So as I said before, developed countries, there's a higher income per capita, more people have stable jobs, have amounts of wealth, etc. They are more willing and they're more able to pay for goods or services. So the higher the income across an economy or across the market, the higher demand will be illustrated. Another factor in demand that influences people's purchasing decisions, because really when we're talking about demand, we're talking about consumers and what they are willing to purchase. When we think about our circular flow of our economy, etc., we're talking demand is all about the consumer interests, what's driving consumers. And one thing we see when income is incorporated into understanding of market dynamics is that when people have higher incomes, when they have more wealth, they demand more what we call normal goods. And these are goods that might be like brand name. So if you think about it, when you're at like the grocery store and you're in the cereal aisle, these are your Lucky Charms, these are your Captain Crunches, these are your Apple Jacks. I really don't know what cereal they're into these days, but the name brand items. Those are our normal goods. When we have more income, demand for normal goods increases. When people across an economy have less incomes, demand for normal goods will decrease. So a normal good is kind of like your stationary, your baseline goods. When people have higher incomes, demand for inferior goods will increase. And when people have less incomes, demand for inferior goods will increase, which makes sense, right? If you have a lot of wealth, if you're feeling good in your economy, you're feeling good with your financial situation, you're gonna buy those Lucky Charms because they're magically delicious. But if your income is less, if you're not working as a higher paying job, if you're concerned about your financial future, etc., you are not buying those Lucky Charms. You might be buying the Safeway version of that, which are like, fruity marshmallows or whatever they're called, right? So typically we see when economies are struggling, recession indicators you might see memed about. This is a recession indicator that people are going for the store brand items as opposed to the name brand items. So name brand items are normal goods, store brand items are inferior goods. And that is influenced by how much where their economy is at. Another factor that influences our demand, plotting our demand graphs, etc., is the market size itself. So how many people are in a market. So if you are in an area with a large market, a large population, then you're going to see more demand. If you're in an area with a smaller population, you see less demand. So this can also be like just general population size. So we're in the Bay Area. There's 8 million people in the Bay Area. There's a lot of wealth. There's a lot of people. So we see a lot of demand for goods and services. There's a lot of options for us here, right? Lots of different places to go buy hamburgers, lots of different places to go buy shoes, all sorts of services, boba up the wazoo, lots and lots of demand. If we're going out to a rural community, we're somewhere in like Wyoming where there's less people in Wyoming than there are in San Francisco, so 800,000 across the entire state, you see a much smaller market, much less demand. You're going to see maybe one boba shop, per the state. Maybe there's a couple now, but way fewer businesses, which makes sense. It's not beneficial to the businesses to want to set up shop there because there's not that many people. And when there's not that many people, there's not that many consumers. Other factors that we see with market size is when areas are growing, we'll see demand increasing because more people are in the area. They're demanding more items, so prices will follow ensue. And when areas are diminishing in size, or shrinkage, that's an economic term, we see demand decrease. this all makes sense, right? When we're thinking about like our own actions, when we're thinking about what drives us as consumers, a lot of this just makes logical sense. More people, more demand, more wealth, more demand, less people, less wealth, less demand. However, there are other factors that influence us as consumers, our tastes and our expectations. So when things become hot and exciting, demand will increase. So for example, San Mateo, we just had Molly Tea that opened up a couple months ago. Demand super high for that. Every time I walk by Molly Tea, there's a line out the door. People are willing and have the ability to pay for the delicious teas at Molly Tea. Although I've heard that it's not that great, but controversial hot take, who knows? But demand is increased. This is influenced by advertising. This is influenced by Instagram, by social media, by the TikToks. We see that constantly. Think about like all the beauty crazes, all that stuff is influenced, and then that influences us consumers. So if you're like really interested in manipulating people and encouraging them to like spend their dollars however you want to see it happen, get into marketing and advertising, because you can just really mess with people's minds and make a whole lot of money at it. Another factor that influences demand is consumer expectations. So if we think something's going to go on sale, are we going to buy it now? If we think something's going to go sale in the future, no. If you're able to wait, you're going to wait for that. Or conversely, if you think prices are going to go up, you're going to buy it now, right? Because you don't want to pay more later. So thinking about stuff like that influences. Last week I told you about how I like to buy holiday stuff the day after the holidays because prices are super low, because they're just trying to get rid of these items so they don't waste away on the shelves. So I myself am not going to buy right now or during the holiday. I'm going to wait for the holiday season to be over, and then I'm going to snatch up all those sales. And then I have lots of great decorations for the upcoming holiday season. So that's an example of me, because I know that things are going to go on sale after the holidays. So consumer taste and consumer expectations influence. And then the three final factors, things that we think about: demand, substitutes, and complements. Substitutes, as the name implies, goods or services that can be used in place of others. So if the price drops of a substitute, demand will increase for that item and decrease for the original product. If prices go up on a substitute, then demand for the original product will stay the same or even increase. So for example, if we're thinking about like McDonald's and Burger King, they can be substitutes, right? Like you have a Whopper at Burger King and you have a Big Mac at McDonald's. I think that's correct. If the price of the Whopper, like if Burger King is like, we're having a sale, very exciting, and Whoppers are now on sale, then demand for Whoppers will increase and demand for Big Macs will decrease, because burgers are burgers, and people want the best deal. We can also see that with items like margarine versus butter. If margarine goes on sale, then people are gonna, go buy the margarine and not buy the butter, and so on and so forth. I don't know why all my examples are food related, but food drives us all, so we're going to go with that. So substitutes have kind of an inverse relationship, where the price is on a substitute. Well, then if the price is low on a substitute, then demand will increase for that item and decrease for the original, and vice versa. Conversely, on the other way of thinking about things are complements, and these are goods and services that complement each other. So peanut butter and, yes, jelly. Macaroni and cheese. Again, everything is food related, but just go with it. So if demand increases or decreases for one, then we often see a corresponding increase or decrease for the other. So if peanut butter goes on sale, demand for that goes up. People often are going to buy peanut butter, and then what else are they going to buy? Jelly. What else are they then going to buy? Bread, because that's why you make a delicious PB&J. So this is something that stores, businesses will often do, is that they will put one of the complementary items on sale, get everyone in, buy that complementary item, but then you can't just buy that complementary item, then you buy the other goods as well. And this is ways that stores and industry still make profits. So even though we're largely talking about consumers, we're also starting to see the role that producers are playing as they manipulate and really use these influences of demand to their best benefits. Oh, and that's my dog barking, so maybe she'll stop. The law of diminishing marginal utility is the last factor on demand. And this is basically that the benefit received from each additional unit of a good or service declines as it's used, right? So you think about it, You're really hungry, you order a pizza, you're so excited to eat that pizza. My dog is so excited to bark at the door. Effie, stop that. And you're eating the first slice of pizza and it's like the best pizza you've ever eaten. Oh my gosh, it's so delicious. Amazing. You then are like, you know what? I'm still hungry. So you're going to eat a second slice of pizza and you're like, it's still really good. I love pizza. It's delicious. And you're like, I'm still hungry. Oh my gosh. So you eat a third slice of pizza and you're like, this pizza's okay, but now I'm starting to feel a little kind of gross and full. But then someone's like, hey, you got to eat that pizza. You bought it. So then you get a fourth slice of pizza and you're like, this is not getting delicious any longer. I'm no longer sated. I feel like I'm just eating a lot of bread and cheese. And someone's like, you have to finish the pizza. Eat more pizza. And now you're eating the pizza and this pizza is no longer delicious. It is no longer delightful. It is sitting in your stomach. You are not enjoying this. This is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So diminishing, less marginal each unit. The utility, the joy that you got out of that item, good or service, it is no longer appealing. It is no longer ideal. So that also is going to influence our demand. We love the first item, but you don't want to have too much of an item because then you stop enjoying it so much and then your demand for it goes down. And then maybe you eat so much pizza that you can't even stomach the thought of eating pizza for a while and you don't buy pizza for months after because you just ate so much pizza that first time. So that's our law of diminishing marginal utility. All right. Moving away from pizza, moving back to our graphs, which for some of you really excited to be graphing things out. There's two other things to think about when we're talking about our graphs. So whenever we have our graph, we have our price axis, we have our quantity axis. It's always this way. They're exciting. Our demand slopes are always going to be going sloping downward to the right. So when we see shifts of demand, and that means when something's prompting consumers to buy different amounts at every price level, we're going to see our demand shift will curve, or demand curve will either shift to the right if demand increases across the board, so the entire line shifts to the right, or if demand decreases across the board, the market has shrank, consumer tastes or consumer, everyone found out that Molly Tea was actually like a friend from the mob or something, and now everyone is going to buy less Molly Tea. Or we know that airline tickets are going to go on sale in a month, so everyone is buying fewer airline tickets right now. Or you're like, oh my gosh, I got to buy all this stuff right now because I know the prices are going to go up. Everyone is going to shift to the right. So that's showing us that demand increases when we see those shifts to the right. And when demand lines shift to the left, that shows us that demand is decreased. So that's our big takeaway: right increase, left decrease. Now, when we're talking about different price points, when we're talking about like if we're plotting our demand schedule, and we're talking about the actual like different plots along the demand curve, that's going to be the change in quantity demanded. So if you think back to our demand schedule where we plotted out those prices and we said at $100, 5 people would be buying the item, but at $80, 10 people would be buying the item. The change in quantity demanded from those 2 points, that is illustrating that change along the demand slope. And that team is basically everything that we're going to talk about demand right now. To switch it over from the consumers to the producers, let's talk very quickly about supply. I'm not going to go into great detail because a lot of it is very complementary to demand. But what is supply? It's the mirror of demand. So if demand's the willingness and ability of consumers to buy goods and services, supply is the willingness and the ability of producers to offer goods and services for sale. And in order for us to really consider this to be supply part of our market, producers must have both. So it's not enough just to have an idea of something you want to be able to sell to, the economy, to your market, etc. You have to actually be able to make the item and actually put it up for sale. So you have to have both of those things. We have the law of demand: higher the prices, lower the demand, and inverse. Supply is the opposite. So the higher the price, the more willing the producer is to make a good or service, which makes sense because if the prices of something is super high and people are willing to buy it, then as a producer, you want to make more of that item. Why? Because that's going to give you more profit. So the higher the price, the more willing we see this. It's a direct relationship. Same thing like we saw with the demand schedules and plotting out on the demand curves. We do the exact same thing with supply. The only difference is that unlike a demand curve, which slopes downward to the right, a supply curve slopes upward to the right. Very exciting. It goes the opposite direction. Makes sense though, because it's a direct relationship. So here's our lower prices. Here's our lower supply. Here's our higher prices. Here's our higher supply. Very exciting. Now, in an ideal economy, you want these two dots to match up because that's the ideal spot. That's the equilibrium point, and we'll talk about that later. Ooh, something to look forward to. Exciting. All right, real fast, let's talk about what influences changes in supply. So what does this mean? It means when producers are offering goods and services at different prices. Production costs and supply have an inverse relationship. Why? Because if it costs a lot to make a product, if it costs so much that you are no longer making a profit or you're making a very small profit, you're not going to want to make that profit or make that item nearly as much. So the higher the production costs, the less likely producers are to offer a good or service for sale. What are these input costs, these production costs? These are the resources needed to produce a good service. So if we think about the four factors of production: land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So if you're making hamburgers and suddenly, there's a bum crop of lettuce and now lettuce is super expensive, you're not going to make as many hamburgers, right? Because if it costs a lot to buy that lettuce, it costs a lot to buy those tomatoes and the burger buns, etc., you're going to be less likely to offer that because you're not making a profit. So the higher the input costs, the higher the production costs, the less supply producers are going to be able to offer to make a profit. And if it gets to the point where it is too expensive, if the land or the labor, et cetera, is too expensive, then these producers will stop offering the product altogether and leave the market. So it's a delicate balance. You don't want things to be so expensive that people leave, but you also want to be paying people, paying your land and your labor a fair wage. And this is where it gets real dicey and why we see businesses leaving the United States. Why? Because labor is way cheaper in other countries, and there's benefits to that for these producers, so that way they can, have their profits, etc. It's benefits for that for the consumers, but there's also the human impact on that, right? And as consumers, these are things that we want to be thinking about. What are we willing to accept? What are we willing to tolerate as far as these input costs? Especially as it runs labor, especially runs like humanity, as well as the environment. These are things that I encourage you to think about as you become consumers yourselves. All right, other factors that influence our supply: labor productivity and technology. So the more efficient labor is, the greater supply you're going to see these producers offer because they're then able to make more of a profit. We saw that with American Factory, right? What's the last scene of American Factory? We see these managers be like, we're going to replace those 4 workers with a robot, those 4 workers with a robot. It's real cheap to have a robot, and also robots are very efficient, which means the supply of those automobile glasses would be more effective and they'd be able to offer more of them and therefore make more profit. When labor is unproductive, when technology is not as advanced, then you see less supply. And you think about developing countries, one of the reasons why they do not have as many advanced products as you see in a developed nation. This is because technology, the capital, so the resources used to produce those goods and services are not as advanced, and therefore you see that not being offered as much. Also think about historically, this is why back in the day, before the Industrial Revolutions, people had 1 or 2 sets of clothing. Nowadays we have so many sets of clothing, right? And that's because technology has developed so much that we can produce goods at a very rapid pace. Other factors that influence our supply are government. We live in a mixed market economy, so this is where we see the government playing a role. The government regulation through taxing, through having minimum wage laws, through having laws around what is overtime, et cetera, all of that. That's going to increase costs, which then can limit or diminish supply. So again, this is where we start thinking about where do we want our government to land? Do we want our government to regulate more? Which is great because it protects workers, it protects in that sense, but it also then can impact supply, and that can increase our impact on prices or the amount of items that are offered. Because remember, if there's less supply, we do often see higher demand, and when there's higher demand, prices go up. When there's greater supply, prices go down. But is that at the expense of the workers? It's a delicate balance, and we're constantly negotiating this. And when you think about that, there's 318 plus million people in this country who all have differing views on what the role of the government should be. You understand why it becomes so very complicated. What's not complicated, though, is the final influence on supply, and that is the number of producers. Just like we see with price, it's a direct relationship, same thing for the number of producers. The more producers there are, the more supply there is. If you only have one business that's making hamburgers in a town, you're only going to have X amount of hamburgers, however many they can produce. But if you have 10 hamburger shops in a town, now you have tenfold the amount of hamburgers, so many more hamburgers, so delicious, even though beef is problematic and something to think about. That's a story for another day. But the more producers there are, the more supply you are going to see. And that is all, team. You did it. You got through the lecture, so congrats. You are going to watch the crash course video that goes into a little greater detail on some of these points that I hope will reinforce your knowledge. And when I see you in class next week, we'll talk about what happens when demand and supply interact and the beautiful equilibrium price that they shall seek. So have a great week, and I will see you all next week.